In the Korean War, the Americans made a lot of fools and suffered repeated defeats. The domestic political economy was also messed up by the failure of the Korean War. But the United States still wants to swell the face to pretend to be a fat man, but the face was indeed swollen by the volunteers, but the fat man did not pretend to be fat. After the war, the United States ranked a list of 8 famous generals of the Korean War. Boss Penn ranked 2nd, and 5-star General MacArthur only ranked 4th. So who is this number 1? As the commander-in-chief of the victorious side, Mr. Penn, why can he only rank 2nd? The first place in the American list is Ridgway. This is the United States parachuted into North Korea to replace MacArthur's commander. Objectively speaking, Lee Kuei did bring some troubles to the volunteers. He observed that the supply lines of the volunteers were weak, so he focused on cutting off the supplies of the volunteers. He was also good at learning and analyzing the tactics of the volunteers. Compared with dealing with MacArthur, Lee Kuei is obviously more difficult to deal with. With his own power, he reversed the decline of the U.S. 8th Army and stopped the powerful offensive of the volunteers. It can be seen that Lee Kuei can indeed be regarded as a general, but in the author's heart, this number 1 belongs to Penn Hui. The second place in the American list is Penn Hui. Penn was always the commander-in-chief of the volunteer army to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea. He used the few to win the many and the weak to win the strong to the extreme. In the early stage of the Korean War, our army was seriously short of supplies, but countless heroes and countless miraculous battles were born. Boss Penn strategized on the Korean battlefield and defeated the fully mechanized American soldiers countless times by relying on snow water and fried noodles. This can be called a miracle in the history of human warfare. Such a legendary figure is only ranked 2nd by the Americans, which is indeed biased. The United States has always emphasized individual heroism. They can't let go of the shame and give this first place to Boss Penn, so they can only put their own General Lee Kuei first. The United States wants to cover it up. The more they deceive themselves and others, the more they can see their fear of Boss Penn and the volunteers. With the proud personality of Americans, Boss Penn can be ranked 2nd, which shows that Boss Penn has indeed hurt and scared the United States. The third place on the list is Deng Hua. After Mr. Penn returned to China to recuperate, Deng Hua took over the command of the Korean battlefield and won many battles. MacArthur ranked 4th. Although MacArthur suffered repeated defeats in the Korean War and his pride and complacency was still very strong, as the commander of the United States in the early stage, the Americans still had to take into account his face and give him a place on the list. 1 location. He didn't make much of it in the Korean War, so ranking 4th is very controversial. Many people even think that MacArthur is not even worthy of the list. Ranked 5th is Han Zion-chu. In the first phase of the campaign to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, Han Zion-chu went to the front line to command every time. Therefore, Han Zion-chu was called Han Bold and Whirlwind Commander. Hong Suezi ranked 6th. Hong Suezi is called Hong Shenxian in China because he is in charge of the volunteer army supply work, and he is often able to see clearly and plan ahead. Although the volunteer supply line was indiscriminately bombed by the United States in the early stage, thanks to Hong Suezi's efforts, the volunteers soon ate 2 dishes and 1 soup, and even occasionally had dumplings. Ranked 7th is Yang Qinghuyue. The 20th Corps he led was impenetrable, and the enemy often couldn't break through Yang Qinghuyue's defense line anyway. Every time the U.S. military dealt with Yang Qinghuyue, they would be stripped of their skins. Ranked 8th is Clark of the United States, but the author thinks that Clark is too good. If he hadn't insisted on going his own way, the Battle of Shanganling would not have become bigger and bigger, and in the end it would have cost all the wealth of the United States and lost everything. All in all, this list is just the opinion of the United States, and the ranking of the generals on the list still takes the face of the United States into consideration, so it is unfair. In 1972, Nixon, then U.S. President, announced his visit to China. The news was like a thunderbolt in the world at that time. All of a sudden, the eyes of the whole world are focused on China. During this visit, Nixon made 2 requests. One was to meet Chairman Mao, and the other was to visit the 39th Army. The former request is understandable. After all, Chairman Mao's achievements are known all over the world, but why is the 39th Army worthy of a country's leaders coming across the ocean to see by name? Here we have to mention the Red 15th Army, the predecessor of the 39th Army. including the Red 25th Army and the Red 26th Army. This Red Army participated in the Eastern Expedition and the War of Resistance against Japan. During the War of Resistance against Japan, the 15th Red Army Corps was reorganized into the 344th Brigade of the 115th Division of the 8th Route Army. Lin Biao served as the division commander, Nai Rongzhen served as the deputy division commander, and Su Haidong served as the brigade commander. Subsequently, the 344th Brigade joined the new 4th Army and was incorporated into the new 4th Army of Marshal Chen Yi, designated as the 3rd Division of the new 4th Army. The 39th Army participated in many battles in the War of Liberation and made great contributions to the liberation of the whole country. Therefore, the 39th Army won the reputation of Tiger King among the 5 tigers in the 4 fields. When the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea broke out in 1950, our army crossed the Yalu River with pride. Not to be outdone, the 39th Army was led by Army Commander Woo Zinkin to fight in North Korea. In the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, Woo Zinkin's troops were undefeated. They wiped out the 8th Regiment of the 1st Division of the U.S. Cavalry and the first part of the 12th Regiment of the 1st Division of the South Korean Army. You know, the 1st Cavalry Division of the U.S. Army used to be known as the 160-year undefeated Army, but it was slapped by the 39th Army in its first battle. In the Battle of Yunchon, the 1st Cavalry Division of the 8th Troop of the U.S. Army was killed by 1,800 people by the 39th Army, which ended in a complete victory for the 39th Army. In the second battle that followed, the 39th Army took back Pyongyang in 4 hours. In the third battle, the 39th Army broke through the 38th parallel and successfully captured Seoul. In the first battle, more than 5,000 people from the 20th Division of the U.S. Army were wiped out. Even Americans have to admit that Chinese soldiers are the ceiling of the world's infantry. It is not difficult to see why Nixon's roll call depends on the 39th Army. He just wanted to see what kind of army could rely on extremely backward equipment to defeat the fully mechanized and high-tech American soldiers. After Chairman Mao heard Nixon's request, he smiled. It seems that he is still not convinced. Premier Zhou was puzzled after hearing this, while Chairman Mao explained, Nixon was born in a soldier, like the Navy. He must not be convinced why he couldn't beat the Chinese army. He wanted to see what kind of army could beat them to 0. 8 falls. The facts are indeed what Chairman Mao guessed. During the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea, Nixon often read the battle report sent from the front. In the battle report, the designation of the 39th Army is very dazzling, but whenever the U.S. military suffers mass casualties or defeats, he can always see the name of the 39th Army. Nixon was very puzzled at the time. How could flesh and blood compete with airplanes and cannons? After he visited the 39th Army, he understood why the 39th Army was invincible. During the visit, Nixon found that he had never seen such a team with such faith and drive. He put it this way, supporting this army is strong faith and respect and obedience to the country's leaders. At this point, Nixon fully understood why the U.S. military with such excellent equipment could not beat the volunteers. Because the power of belief in the People's Army is extremely powerful. As Chairman Mao said in his poem, the army and the people are united as one. Let's see who in the world can be the enemy. At 11 o'clock in the morning on November 24, 1950, Mao Anying was working intensively in the war room. At this time, U.S. military planes were roaring above the headquarters. The U.S. military planes flew day and night, but none of them really came to bomb, and everyone had long been numb to this sound. At this time, Chen Pu was still on high alert, standing at the door and looking up constantly. Because the plane had already circled several times, as if it was looking for some target. Chen Pu was ready to ask the two of them to escape at any time, but the speed of the plane was still too fast, and the enemy plane swooped down and came to the top of the war room. Chen Pu hurriedly shouted, "Run," but before he finished speaking, napalm bombs rained down on the war room. Chen Pu was instantly blown away by the blast. Fortunately, he only suffered some skin injuries. But Mao Anying and Gao Ruxin had no time to escape, and died heroically on their posts. After the incident, President Pen held back for an hour before sending a telegram of more than 100 characters to the chairman. After hearing the news of Mao Anying's sacrifice, the chairman held back tears and said, "It's okay, there is no one who survives a war." But the chairman himself was holding on to his grief, and did not reveal the news of Mao Anying's death to his daughter-in-law Liu Saiqi at all. Because the two had just married, he was afraid that his daughter-in-law would not be able to bear the blow, so he kept telling him that Mao Anying was still working in North Korea and would come back when the war in North Korea was over. But in the end, the fire could not be covered with paper. Chairman Mao lied to Liu Saiqi for 3 years, until the war to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea ended in victory in 1953, and a large number of fighters to resist U.S. aggression and aid Korea began to return to China one after another. Chairman Mao couldn't hide it anymore, so he had to tell his daughter-in-law the truth. Liu Saiqi burst into tears after learning of this. It took a long time to slow down. Chairman Mao loved this daughter-in-law like his own daughter. He said to Liu Saiqi, "The Communist Party does not follow the feudal society and stick to one end. You are still young, so start a family as soon as possible." But Liu Saiqi refused straight away, saying that he would not remarry. After the chairman persuaded him many times, Liu Saiqi still did not let go. It wasn't until 1959 that Liu Saiqi got the opportunity to go to North Korea to visit Mao Anying's grave. After visiting Mao Anying's grave, Liu Saiqi got his wish, so he agreed to Chairman Mao's proposal to get married again. But Liu Saiqi has never found Mr. Ruyi. Chairman Mao sees it in his eyes and feels pain in his heart, but there is no substantive solution. Chairman Mao felt that Liu Saiqi was too picky, so he tried to persuade her again. Chairman Mao once said to his daughter Li Na that when looking for a partner, one must find a partner that one likes and has a good character, preferably the son of a farmer or a worker. His admonition to Liu Saiqi is the same as to his daughter: you have to listen to the advice and make up your mind to get married. It's a common problem for girls like you to be too high or not to be low. Then Chairman Mao found many old friends and began to match Liu Saiqi, and finally selected a teacher of the Air Force Academy. This person's name was Yang Mazai, and the two met soon under the arrangement of the chairman. After the two came into contact with each other, they felt that each other was very good, so they entered the Palace of Marriage in 1962. Chairman Mao finally let go of his worries, and he happily sent someone to send 600 yuan to Liu Saiqi. 600 yuan was quite a fortune at the time. These are all from the royalties Chairman Mao received for publishing anthologies and anthologies. Then Chairman Mao personally wrote a song Buletin Suanzi Yang Mei and Li Bai's Lushan ballad to Liu Xiu Says Hu and gave it to Liu Saiqi. These two big gifts can also show that the chairman attaches great importance to Liu Saiqi. We must know that when the chairman's own daughter Li Na got married, the chairman only sent a personal letter, 2 military coats, and a set of the complete works of Marx and Engels. And Liu Saiqi did not disappoint Chairman Mao. He lived a happy life with Yang Mazai and had 4 sons. In memory of Mao Anying, the eldest son was named Yang Xiaoying. Before the volunteers entered North Korea to fight, the US and South Korean troops often ran after the North Korean army, but after the volunteers entered North Korea, everything changed. The South Korean army used the talent of escape to the extreme, and often left the US troops to be beaten alone. The volunteer army's entry into North Korea had a decisive impact on the situation of the Korean War, and the comparison between before and after is very exaggerated. This should start before the volunteer army entered North Korea to fight. On June 25, 1950, a conflict broke out between North Korea and South Korea on the 38th parallel, and North Korea took advantage of this conflict. Because North Korea was fully armed at this time, there were 7 divisions, 60,000 people deployed near the 38th parallel, and the North Koreans obtained a large number of weapons left by the Japanese, so they won several beautiful victories in the early stage. After the conflict on the 38th parallel, the Soviet Union strongly supported North Korea's war. If the Korean peninsula was controlled by a socialist country, it would be of great benefit to the big brother, the Soviet Union. Stalin was also confident that the United States would never join the war at this time, but soon Stalin was slapped firmly in the face. But everything changed with the entry of the United States into the fray. After the US Army landed in Incheon, they led the South Korean Army to launch a counterattack. Although the combat effectiveness of the North Korean Army is not bad, compared with the American soldiers, it is really beggars and dragon kings. Soon North Korea was retreating steadily. After the Americans tasted the sweetness, they found that the soft persimmon of North Korea was really easy to pinch, so the US combat goal was changed from repelling North Korea past the 38th parallel to occupying the Korean peninsula. So how miserable are North Korean soldiers and civilians? After the United States landed, it quickly cut off the supply of the North Korean army. With its powerful air firepower, North Korea's defense line was like paper. North Korea is already very poor, and in addition to being in a long-term war confrontation, there are not many troops capable of fighting. With the intervention of the United States, North Korea will only recruit some teenage child soldiers. And because the supply line is cut off, it is common for the North Korean army to go hungry and full. The equipment and firepower were completely backward, and now they couldn't even eat enough, and the big brother of the Soviet Union didn't give any support. In desperation, North Korea had to ask China for help. At that time, high-level Americans were as confident as Stalin, China will never intervene in the war. But face-slapping always came quickly. In October of that year, the Volunteer Army entered the DPRK in a mighty manner. After the Volunteer Army entered the DPRK, everything changed qualitatively. At first, the Volunteer Army faced the same problems as the North Korean Army, that is, insufficient firepower and supply lines were cut off. But the Volunteer Army insisted on gnawing on frozen potatoes, and gnawed off the hard bone of the US military bit by bit. And under the operation of Hong Shensien Hong Suezi, the Volunteer Army created a unique mode of transportation, and soon the food of the Volunteer Army soldiers was improved. Before the volunteer soldiers entered the DPRK, the South Korean Army was extremely arrogant, which also made North Korea suffer. After the Volunteer Army entered North Korea to fight, the South Korean Army brought its characteristics to the extreme, that is, the speed of escape. South Korea and the US military jointly fought. As long as they found something wrong in the front, they quickly changed from the rear to the front and rushed all the way to the rear, leaving the US military alone in the position to scold and beat. How fast can Koreans run? In a prisoner of war sports meeting in 1952, the Korean Army took the top 4 places in the 3,000-meter race, even faster than many blacks. When the Korean War reached the later stage, the United States was no longer willing to fight with the Korean Army, but fought with the United Nations Army. As for the Koreans, anyway, they run fast, and we don't need the US military to control them at all. After the Battle of Shanganling, the US military was completely beaten by the volunteers, and an armistice agreement was signed soon. So far, South Korea and North Korea have become 2 independent countries with the 38th parallel as the boundary.